Hi everyone, and welcome back to modern history class. And this is lesson number 5, the week number 5, fifth week. And what we've been doing for the last 4 weeks is to go over the timeline, the general timeline of last 100 years or so. Trying to make an overview of all the things before we go into the very topical discussion of the themes and the matters that are relevant and significant to modern church history. So it is more like about 120 years that we are trying to cover. And during that period, there has been some significant shift and changes that were brought into the scene of Christianity, and then how did the church relates itself with the world. And we are about to give our attention to actually this 20th century birth. And we have seen the 19th century development, which is relevant to 20th century development of church history. So I labeled, and generally some scholars, the historians, labeled this century as an age of complexity. The things become more complex, not only within the church itself, but with the world that we live in. The reality, what we see today, is much more complex than the reality 100 years ago, or even 200 years ago. You don't have to go that far. Just 50 years ago, it wasn't this complex, as much as complex as what we see today. So that means we are living in a very complex world. So we've discussed some of this. Year 1901, it began with the speaking the tongue. And then that brings us into this charismatic trend, which leads also to the awakening, the Second Great Awakening. And as we see, 1906 is a very significant year for American Christianity, where the Azusa Street revival was there. And we see the churches kind of getting together, trying to form a national unity, which is also called an ecumenical movement. Ecumenical at the beginning was evangelical, conservative, fundamental churches getting together to unite their efforts for the foreign missions. They are already satisfied with the domestic missions within America, North America. So their eyes were put on to other areas of the world, especially when they go through the World War I and World War II. As these young people, young Americans, most of them are very dedicated Christians. As they go into the war, that there are a couple questions that troubled these young Christian soldiers. Number one, what is the meaning of this war? Killing each other. And then that's very natural for these young soldiers to ask as they engage themselves in this killing. Many of them thought it's meaningless, and even though they are doing it out of patriotic cause, still they were trying to find the answers within their belief, which is most of them were Christians. So that was a first question. And then second question they asked was, as they see this underdeveloped, not only it's underdeveloped, as many people in the world at the time of First World War and the Second World War even, they were living like, most in poverty, like animals. Not to mention, having no medical support. So they were dying out of hunger and out of very simple disease, the sickness that can be cured with just a little medication. So they asked, what can I do to serve these very unfortunate people, as they see it in with their own eyes. It's not like that you're watching it on a newspaper, reading it on a newspaper. It doesn't give you that much impact. But when they were there in the war zone, seeing these people in Philippines and Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on, they were asking these questions. So those questions eventually came to the zeal and the need and the commitment for them to go overseas to serve. Because at the time, America was the richest country in the world. Probably still is, but in the early 20th century, America was booming. It was rich. They had more than they need. So it was natural for them to go to overseas. And the churches kind of thought, how can we do it better? And the answer was, we got to go united. So as we see, 1910 and so on. 1908 and 1910 International Missionary Conference. All these things were geared toward making this mission, overseas mission, more effective. It's a little warm here. Let me take my coat off. So, in 1912, social creed of the church is adopted. Okay. This ought to be another significant development in 20th century, the modern church history. So as we look this timeline overview, we are seeing what the major discussions will be, the topic of this discussion. So this social concerns or social responsibility becomes something of interest As I discussed in the last class, when the church is more like a state and state is more like a church, and the state, the nation is governed by most of the cabinets are Christians, and they had even though they are from the different denominations, still they were serving under the assumption that they are doing service to people because of it is God-given mandate. And the social responsibility was not something that you need to discuss. It was natural for them to church is the state and state is the church. Church is willing to serve their own people when they are in needs, whether they are orphans, whether they are widows, or they are handicapped. Whatever the causes were, when there were needs and weakness and problems to be served, church was more than willing to do that. But it has changed drastically from 19th century to 20th century as they go into the 20th century, so-called secularization. The world they live in, the context, their church and the non-church. See, this was something new. And also, as they go into the overseas, they see all these social needs for non-believers. Okay? So again, it is different to take care of your own church, and there's no need to separate evangelism to social concerns. But now as the community and the nation, it divides into those who are believing, the Christians, and there are non-Christians. As the non-Christian population grows, they were never concerned, but now there is a concern: how are we going to serve? Do we need to serve? Actually, do we need to serve these people who are not in the church? So it doesn't happen overnight. It became, it was a slow development, slow change, not a sudden shift. So they did not know, they were not, church leaders and the church itself were not aware the whole context was changing. So now it is divided. It was more like this. It was. Church is a state and state the church. It more overlaps. And then as the history goes on, it becomes so there are people in the church, though there are people who are not in the church. So that separation caused them to think of the social concerns. So implications, we looked at this charismatic trend, and then spirit-led great awakening, then liberal theology. That's another big development. And then ecumenical movement, we talked about it, social concerns issue. Then hard conservative Christianity. And the church itself begins to kind of divide. It's not like the Catholic against Protestant. That was like a few hundred years ago, several centuries ago. Now, within the church and the Protestant church itself, the denomination division is one thing. I mean, it does not divide the church so much, but not only the American church, the global church in general, especially the church in the England and Europe, then church in America, they were the leading, I mean, early 20th century. Still, these Western Christianity is the Christianity itself. Western church is the church. So there were no big development within the third world churches. For example, China, Korea, and Africa, and South America, the Protestant church was not strong. We know that in South America, the dominant religion now, at the time of 20th century, the Catholic is the dominant church, dominant religion, Christianity in South America and Central America and Mexico. So from the Mexico and down is all Catholic Christianity. In Africa, I mean, the African missions began not that early. So it begins at the late 19th century, the effective African missionary efforts in America, in Africa, it begins at the end of 19th century. So in early 20th century, it's still at the beginning. So there was no strong, solid African church yet, except some of those, Anglican churches in the English colonies. So still, in Africa, it's a very, very baby church. So is South America. In Asia, it's the same thing. Asia was dominant with Buddhism and other folk religion. And it's again late 19th century. For example, in Korea, the first professional missionaries came in. See, China, little much earlier. In Japan, it was 18th century. But for some reason, the Catholic were more stronger than the Protestant in Japan as well. So in these other countries, the so-called third world or other world or Orient, now you're not supposed to use the word Orient, no longer is politically incorrect. But at the time they used term Orient to refer to these East Asian countries, right? So on those lands, there are no presence of Christianity. So basically it was in North America and Europe. And the church begins to divide itself. And this division is more than denominational, much stronger than denominational. And church divides itself with the left and the right. And within even the right, there is a so-called fundamental fundamentals and not so fundamentals, or evangelicals. So this hard conservative Christianity begins to form itself. We looked at the age of ideologies. As World War I begins, in 1919, Karl Barth writes a commentary on Romans. And that's kind of beginning of liberal theology. Then there's a C.S. Lewis comes to faith in Christ. And the C.S. Lewis, he becomes a leader, one of the leaders in evangelical thoughts, and also in so-called intellectual movement within Christianity. And Wycliffe Bible translators, also mission agencies. This is a very significant development, because Western Christianity begins to realize and says every single ethnic group with their own language and with the letters, even if they do not have letters, the Western world was willing to provide them with the tools, the writing tools, using basically the Roman characters. This development says each and every single ethnic cultural group is unique, and it is valuable because God had intended to create them in that way. So not only the Western world recognized the distinctive ethnic identity, but they were willing to serve each different cultures and ethnic groups. So that this perspective about the cultures, different cultures and different ethnic groups, and the beginning to serve them becomes one of the important perspective. Because before this, the major idea about the Western church toward this third world underdeveloped regions were, they were giving some benefits. They thought, the church thought, we are giving you the benefits. We are giving you the gifts. We are the better ones and you are the less ones. So there was this kind of, vertical structure between the first world, the Western church, and others. See? So that kind of mentality is still there for some Christians, some Western Christians still. But it was only in the 20th century which they begin to break that wrong ideology. Then we had World War II implications. So this conflict between the Christianity and ideology begins to come, and the ideology begins to threaten Christianity, and it still is. It continues to do so. So modern Christianity, as we see, we are putting ourselves up against, number one, Islam. That's development since last 50 years or so. The reason this happened is because of this oil money. As the Middle East, they begin to enrich themselves, make them rich. using the oil money. Much of its oil money go into the religious cause, their missionary efforts, Islam mission efforts. It's a big agenda. And they also want to dominate the world with the Islamic belief, just as the Christians do the same thing. So they, with the lots of this abundant resources, they begin to explore ways to reach every corner of the world. So that's one thing that Christianity is up against. And it's our point of view is a religion, but it's also a kind of ideology. The reason I'm saying this is because most, not even if it's not all, most of these Islamic states, they use Islamic belief and religion as an ideology to govern their state. So when religion is used to govern the state and people, it becomes the same as ideology. Because my definition is of ideology is the belief system or idea or the spirit to govern the people. So that's ideology there. And another ideology that you need to put up with is communism. That's development in mid 20th century. Okay, newer theology, especially so-called left. Okay. So-called liberal theology is a big development in 20th century. Another big trend, development that we see during the early 20th century is the beginning of globalization. And we see this globalization continuing. Pandemic, global warming, all this has to do with the globalization as well. Not only the globalization of commerce, it comes. Then post-war expansion of missions. So we discussed this already. So paradox in Christian states and the New World Order. See, it used to be the Europe, England and France and Germany and Spain and Portugal. These are the ones who had developed the colonies over Africa and South America, in even some part of Asia. But now the power, global power, or the world power shifts from England to America. So New World Order becomes apparent, and it stays until today. But there's a, we see there's a big change. It used to be America against Soviet Union. Or the Western democratic states, including Europe and America, versus Soviet Union. And that power order shifts. And then America dominates for last 30, 40 years since the fall of Berlin, the East Germany, fall of Soviet Union. And then the China comes up and it begins to fill that void created by the fall of Soviet Union. So China now becomes our second, even the first world power. And this is a historically very key development. The question would be whether is China going to continue to sustain itself as a communist or socialist states with one man ruling political structure. And we know, the head of the China Xi is trying to extend his rule another 5 or 6 years and trying to become more of monarchy himself. And everyone knows that. The Chinese knows that, and the Western world knows that, and he wants to extend his rule until his death. So it's basically he's like the king or the emperor. And the reason I'm saying this is that development in China would be a very big indicator in understanding and interpreting the world history and the modern church history and its future. So mid-20th century, Boltzmann calls for a demythologization. What does that mean, demythologization? It means, the Boltzmann says, he not only says, he believes that there are some, even though not all of them, but there are some mythological elements in the Christian belief and in the Bible, the scripture. As he reads, he finds there's these very significant passages that has been mythologized. And that's another trend or the perspective of liberal theology. So Boltzmann is a theologian, and he calls for the mythologization of Christianity. And Ronald Niebuhr, Nature and Destiny of Man, his social perspective also contributes to the development of liberal theology. And then National Association of Evangelicals formed. Now that's significant because in year 1940 and so on, see, as we read this development of liberal theology, It does not happen, did not happen overnight, slowly developing and gathering themselves as a kind of group and a scholastic group. So those on the right, or so-called conservative Christians, try to form themselves against these left churches or left theology. In 1945, atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima and then also in Nagasaki. So there are two bombings that kind of put the end to the Second World War. And it's very ironic that the America did not even consider using this atomic bomb against Germans, but chose to do it in Asia against Japan, and not one but two bombs. So we need to think about that too. 1947, Dead Sea Scrolls discovered. Okay, that is a very significant incident that also happened in Christianity. Okay, let's take a short break and let me come back. Okay, let us continue. So Dead Sea Scroll. That's the scroll of the Qumran community, and there's some of the oldest copies of Bible. And it does prove authenticity of the biblical text, and they compared that text to the modern biblical text and found just a little difference, which means today's Bible, the copies of the Bible is pretty much the same as the ones thousand years ago. In 1948, World Council of Churches organized, and I didn't write it here, but at the same year, the nation of Israel, the state of Israel, was restored, and the United Nations, not United States, United Nations, they recognize Israel as a national state. So that becomes very significant here. And the World Council of Churches, as they form, they are ready to become the agent of this liberal theology. Because this liberal theology is already broad within many European churches, especially those in Germany and France. So as they join the World Council of Churches, which is the joint body, united body, just like a United Nations, it's a united body of the national churches. And it depends on which national church they represent. The theology was from the left to the right. So wide variety of the theologies were coming together, trying to form a one body, which never worked in history. Any kind of organization that trying to come together to form a one united body with a different spirit, sometimes very polarized perspective and thoughts and ideologies and beliefs, they cannot come together to form one body. It's not possible. So that 1948 was the beginning of the division, even though, ironically, even though they tried to form a one global body for all the churches, it never worked, but it was the beginning of the division. Then we see the Billy Graham beginning to have his work and impacting not only America but global churches, especially the evangelical churches. Mid-20th century still. 1950, missionary forces to leave China. And then we know at the same year, in the June, the Korean War broke. The North Korea, backed by Soviet Union, they invaded South Korea. That's the historical facts. And then in 1952, I believe, the China joins North Korea to move down the American, the United Nation forces that was almost up there to the two rivers that divide China and Korean Peninsula. So when we see this, what happened within the church, we also need to see what happens within the general, the secular history as well. And again, in 1950, Assumption of Mary made a dogma that in Catholic Church. And 1950, again, Mother Teresa found the missionaries of charity. So, I mean, the Catholic Church has been doing their social works way before 1950. And this is just one significant landmark incident that we can look at. Then 1951, Bonhoeffer, also one of those prominent liberal theologian, writes a letter and a paper from prison. And 1960, Bennett resigns, charismatic renewal advances. 1962, Vatican II. Vatican II is one of the important, significant historical landmarking incident in Catholic Church, in modern Catholic Church history. Implications, mid-20th century. There's an increased global conflict, 2 wars, and the Second World War is much serious, as much bigger than the First World War. So First World War was within European continent. Now, the Second World War, America get involved, and then Japan get involved, and China get involved, and most East Asian countries, including Korea, Philippines, and all the Indochina nations, they were affected by Second World War because Japan invaded now Myanmar, the Burma, and Thailand, and Laos, and those countries, right? So this global conflict really becomes global. And if hope not, but if there's a third world war, it's going to involve many more countries, and it's going to be more severe, and it's going to have more severe damage than the Second World War. Because Third World War, definitely, it's going to involve the nuclear, weapons, which can kill millions and millions. And it is the church responsibility to try to prevent these things from happening. And the questions against humanity and good and God. They believed, many believed, the human, basically they are good. And that we are developing, we are getting better. But two major world wars. These wars shattered the belief even toward humanity. While this liberal theology bases itself on the ideology of human goodness, the humanity, and evolution, and so on. So the idea of social evolution, which says people are getting smarter and wiser and better, so the human goodness will help the world to become a better place to live. That's basically the theology or the ideology of this humanity. But we know that fails as well. And as they see these wars, killing, mass killing of human beings, they begin to ask a question: where is God? What is God doing? Just looking at this and abandoning humanity and human generation. And they thought, the church thought, many Christians thought, God would involve himself to prevent these from happening, or do something to stop this crazy killing. But it didn't happen. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. So people thought God is not so much interested in human affairs anymore. Many the theologians concluded that, and then that's again one of the reasons for the liberal theology. So theological controversies becomes natural consequence of these things. And then rise of evangelicals. See, the evangelicals were there for a very long time. I mean, from Christ to today, there always been evangelicals. Only we are beginning to label ourselves as evangelicals because there were Catholics and corrupt Catholic Church. So some evangelical Christians begin to reform the church. That's reformation, and protested against Catholic Church because the Bible does not say so. So Bible-believing Christians at the time of Reformation, they protest against Catholic Church and become reformers. Then history goes on. Now there's something called liberals who try to say Bible does have some mythology. We cannot believe these myths. How can you believe in a virgin birth? How can you believe a man resurrecting after 3 days of dying? See, then how can you believe God created all these things in 6 days? And how can you believe Adam and Eve story? And the story of flood? And story of Sodom and Gomorrah being judged with the fire from heaven. See, they thought. And then the wall of Jericho falling down and being destroyed because the Israelite Jews just go around it 7 times. That's a myth. And they said Jesus healing, okay, healing, but how can a man raise a person who is already dead and begin to smell because it's decomposing itself? That's a myth. So the liberals begin to say, we believe in Bible, but not these things. Jesus may said some of the things that were written in the gospel that he is supposed said, but we do not believe all of that is true. Jesus may said some of it. So that's the beginning of liberal ideas and the liberal theology. So there's a controversy, but the evangelicals were there. I mean, that's Bible-based, genuine, pure Christianity. It was there, always been there, but now we begin to call ourselves evangelicals against these other ideas about the Bible and Jesus and the faith and the Christianity in general. So I'll go deeper into this theme of evangelicals because when we discuss the modern church history, the major development within the 20th century modern church history is the rise of evangelicals. Or it's not actually the rise, it is the expression or self-identification or re-identification of ourselves as evangelicals, because there are other secular ideology and then secular theology that is trying to come and attack. And then not only these secular theologies, liberal theologies, but the rise of heresies. Heresies are a big thing in modern church history. There has been some heresies in the past, but not as much as that of today. So today in 20th century and toward the 21st century, we see the very expansion or explosion of heresies and the pseudo-Christianity. Pseudo means not so true Christianities. So false Christianity and the pseudo-Christianity, fake Christianity are prevailing in 20th century, the modern church history. Then there's another trend within the evangelical, the right. There's something called charismatic movements. While we see fundamentals saying there's no more tongue, no more speaking in tongues, no more those hyper spiritual phenomenon. We do not recognize that. While the charismatic, God still works the same way He worked in the time of Pentecost, where the early church beginning, where the Holy Spirit baptized them in very special way. That is not special anymore. The same thing happens amongst us within this 21st century church. So that's charismatic enforcement. So there's another trend within. They are not left. The charismatic is not on the left side. It's on the right side, Bible believing, but they have some different ideas. Charismatic has different ideas about the work of the Holy Spirit, while the fundamentals on this side have different belief about the work of the Holy Spirit. So there is a little division, and that's very theological trend that we find in 20th and 21st century churches. Then expansion of American church. Domestically, American church grows the fastest within 20th century, 19th to 20th century, early 20th century. And it begins to decline, in the 70s and 80s, it begins to decline. And it continues to decline until today. So last 40 or 50 years, the church is losing its members or decreasing. Late 20th century, as we see, 1963, King leads March on Washington. Okay, black rights or civil rights movement. Civil rights movement, basically it is for the black Americans, the Afro-Americans. So the King, Dr. King, or the Reverend King, Luther King, he is the leading figure in the civil rights movement, but we don't consider him to be the liberal in his theology. 1966, Chinese Cultural Revolution. Yeah, those who are from China, you know this history much better than myself, but you may have a different perspective on that very cultural revolution from how we see from the Western world or democratic states. The reason Chinese Cultural Revolution is significant is the very organized persecution against Christians and other religions, including Buddhism, began with the Cultural Revolution. So the communism basically think it's Karl Marx, who said the religion is opium of people. It's like a drug, he said. And so communists would not allow the so-called traditional religion, including Buddhism and even those folk religions, right? Shamanism and so on. So these were all gone. The churches and the temples were destroyed, and many of these religious leaders were killed, executed during that period. So that's one very historic, significant, organized by the government, forced, government-led persecution in modern history. And as far as I know, the same persecution is still going on in China, North Korea, and many of those so-called socialist countries, not to mention Muslim countries. 1968, Medellin Conference advances the liberation theology. So 1968, that particular conference is the very peak of this liberal theology, now eventually become liberation theology. So that liberation theology should be large letter L and large letter T. So what's the liberation theology? We'll discuss further, but liberation theology is communist or radical left political ideology combined with Christian liberal theology. So it becomes liberation theology. And that liberation theology earns its popularity among especially Latin America Christians who were suffering from poverty and political oppression. And the theology, because I told you, most of Latin American population are Catholics. They basically believe in God, but a little different than European Catholic, but still, Catholics are Catholic, and they believe in God, and then this liberation theology says what they want to hear. 1974, Lordland Congress on World Evangelization. That's going to be the key event and incident and gathering in the evangelical circle, or for evangelical Christians. Again, evangelical Christians, just short note here is, are the Christians who believe the Bible is the truth, and the Bible is inspired by God. Every word is important, and it contains the true word of God, and what's recorded in the Bible is true. So we believe in the resurrection, the virgin birth, and we believe in the creation of God in not necessarily 7 days like a 24 hours days today, but as it is recorded. So it's basically Bible-believing Christians who recognize Bible to be the true and infallible, meaning false, without false statement. Okay. Then John Paul II's first visit to Poland. That's significant because that visit was the first visit to the communist or socialist states by the Pope. 1985, Gorbachev, General Secretary of Soviet Communist Party. He's the one who dissolves the Soviet Union. Okay, the implication. The rise of civil rights movement and the rise of non-Western global power, like the Soviet Union, then later the China. Then counter-liberal movement against the liberal theology, because liberal theology becomes a threat to the so-called conservative churches. Then rise of Latin American Protestants. That begins at the very later in the actually in the late 20th century. But it begins during the late 20th century. End of 20th century, 1989, fall of Berlin Wall. And then the same year, Tiananmen massacre. These two incidents happens within so-called communist bloc at the time. Now we don't use that word anymore. But when I was young, we had that word communist bloc. Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and then this Eastern European countries which all belongs to Soviet Union. So these are, the North, China and Soviet as the major two countries. They included many small other countries under their wings as so-called communist bloc. And Berlin, very west of Soviet power, it falls. And there's an uprising within China, Beijing, the main core of Chinese state. The Chinese government, the communist government, was successful in suppressing that uprising at the time. And it did continue to have economical development, mainly selling its goods, products toward Western world who had money and resources. And these dollars and the resources, and now the technology goes into China. And China becomes one of the world's so-called superpower. And China is still representing one of this communist ideals or socialist ideals. And there's still that conflict, and this conflict is increasing as China grows stronger and America becomes weaker. So there's going to be some day in the future in the near future, I believe, the China becomes stronger than America in military power. Of course, the number of population is almost 3-4 times, more than 4 times than United States of America. So human power is much larger already, but military power and economic power and then global influence, we'll see. And that development would have much significant message to the churches. Then fall of Soviet Union, then we have handover of Hong Kong to China, and decrease of Urbana participants. Urbana is very traditional and prominent mission conference, global for the global mission, and many young American people, American students, attend that Urbana conference every 3 years. And there's a significant decrease of the participants in the last decade, last 10 years. So that does say something to us. And year 2009, we see the first non-white president of the United States of America. The President Obama becomes the president. So that's the end of our overview on the timelines, general timelines. And I gave you the pictures and what the preview of the topics that we are going to discuss during this class. So we are halfway through, and we'll try to tackle each topics beginning next week. Okay. So thank you for listening and your attention. And if you could, I want you to go over the last 5 weeks class and try to have that big picture of modern church history in chronological way. That's usually the way we do the history. But beginning next week, we'll go by each significant and relevant topics that had changed the scene of 20th century modern church. Thank you again. See you.